It's funny, the moments that change your life forever rarely announce themselves with a thunderclap. They don't arrive with a warning. For me, it started with a whisper over a plate of untouched sea bass, in a room that smelled of old money and freshly cut hydrangeas. It started at my son's rehearsal dinner. We were at the Glenwood Country Club in Ohio, a place where reputations are the local currency and everyone's secrets are kept behind perfectly starched linen napkins. From the outside, it was a perfect picture. My son Liam, looking handsome, if a little strained, in a suit that was clearly more expensive than anything he could actually afford. And beside him, his fiancée, Chloe. Let me tell you about Chloe. She was, and is, a masterpiece of modern curation. Her hair, her nails, her smile, everything about her was designed to be photographed from a flattering angle. She was a lifestyle influencer, which, as far as I could tell, meant she was an expert at looking wealthy without the inconvenience of actually earning any money. As a retired art history professor, I've spent my life analyzing artifice, and Chloe was a walking, talking masterwork of it. I was sitting at the head table, feeling a bit like a museum piece myself, when she drifted over. "Eleanor, I just love your brooch," she said, her voice as smooth and sweet as the champagne she was holding. She pointed to the sapphire and diamond pin on my dress. "It's so vintage." She said, "Vintage," the way you'd say, expiring. That brooch was the last gift my husband Richard gave me before he passed away. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a memory, a piece of my heart, and she had just dismissed it as a quaint antique. I just smiled. "Thank you, Chloe. It has sentimental value." Liam, my son, just stood beside her, fiddling with his tie, offering a weak smile in my direction. He'd been doing that a lot lately, fading into the background whenever Chloe took center stage. Later, I saw her talking with her bridesmaids. She was laughing, holding court, and I happened to catch a snippet of their conversation as I walked past. One of her friends was admiring her engagement ring, a diamond that was far too large for a mid-level financial analyst's salary. "He did good, right?" Chloe preened, angling her hand in the light. "My mom always told me, 'Honey, you either inherit a legacy or you marry one.' And God knows our family didn't have one to inherit." The words hit me with a clinical coldness. It wasn't a joke, it was a mission statement. This whole wedding, this relationship, it wasn't a union, it was an acquisition. And I was beginning to realize that my son wasn't the prize, he was just part of the deal. I was beginning to suspect that I, or rather what I represented, was the real target. The dinner dragged on. The toasts were given, the polite laughter echoed, but a knot of dread was tightening in my stomach. Finally, as the evening was winding down, Chloe asked me to join her on the terrace overlooking the 18th hole. The air was cool, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine hung in the air. It was a beautiful, peaceful setting for an ambush. "Eleanor," she began, her tone shifting into one of faux intimate concern. "Liam and I were talking, and we are just so worried about you." I stayed silent, waiting. I've learned that in conversations like these, the first person to speak loses. "That big house on Sparrow Hill, it's just so much for one person," she continued, tracing a pattern on the stone balustrade with her perfectly manicured finger. "The upkeep, the stairs, the loneliness. We think we've come up with the perfect solution, a way to take care of you and help us get on our feet. Here it comes," I thought. The final pitch. She turned to face me, her eyes gleaming with a predatory brightness under the soft patio lights. She placed her cold hand on my arm. "As a wedding gift to us, really, we want you to give us the house. Liam and I will move in right after the honeymoon. It's the perfect starter home for us, and we can find a lovely, much more manageable condo for you downtown. It's the only logical thing to do." She smiled, a wide, triumphant expression, as if she had just solved a complex puzzle that had been vexing everyone. She stood there, waiting for me to thank her. She genuinely believed I was going to thank her for orchestrating the theft of my home, my memories, my life. She asked for the keys. She actually asked me when she could pick up the keys to my house. I think I just stared at her for a full 10 seconds. The sheer audacity of it, the absolute, unadulterated entitlement, was breathtaking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gasp. I looked at this young woman who was about to marry my son, this woman who had just demanded my entire life as a party favor, and I gave her a small, tight smile. "Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I think perhaps you've had too much champagne. The house on Sparrow Hill is not, and will never be, on the market, especially not as a gift." I then turned without another word and walked back into the dinner party, leaving her standing alone on that beautiful, jasmine-scented terrace. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The wedding day itself was a 3-ring circus of forced smiles and pastel silk. I moved through it like a ghost, an observer at my own son's life. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was an anthropologist studying the bizarre rituals of a tribe I no longer belonged to. Liam avoided me. He'd catch my eye from across the room, busy laughing with Chloe's father or adjusting his bow tie, and his gaze would just slide right off me, like I was a piece of furniture he'd forgotten was there. He knew a storm was coming, and he had already chosen his side. The confrontation I knew was inevitable happened, of course, at the most public moment imaginable. It was time to cut the cake, a 5-tiered monstrosity that probably cost more than my first car. The photographer was circling, guests had their phones out, and the air was thick with that fake, celebratory cheer. That's when Chloe chose to strike. She waited until the mayor's wife and the head of the local hospital board were standing right beside me, admiring the cake. She glided up, linking her arm through mine as if we were the best of friends. "Eleanor, darling," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I do hope you've had a chance to reconsider our little chat from last night. Liam is so excited about starting our new life in a proper family home." The mayor's wife looked at me with polite curiosity. Chloe had framed it perfectly. Now, if I refused, I wasn't just saying no to her. I was being a difficult old woman in front of the town's most influential people. It was a checkmate, or so she thought. I gently removed her arm from mine. "Chloe," I said, my voice low but clear, "there is nothing to reconsider. The discussion is over." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. They turned into 2 little chips of ice. "I don't think you understand," she hissed, the sweetness vanishing from her voice. "We need that house. You are being incredibly selfish." "And you," I replied, "are being incredibly mistaken." And that's when it happened. Her hand moved so fast, I barely saw it coming. It was the sound that registered first, a sharp, cracking noise that wasn't champagne glasses toasting. It was the sound of her palm connecting with my cheek. A bright, searing pain exploded across my face, and the force of it sent my glasses flying. They hit the polished oak floor with a sickening clatter. The music from the string quartet faltered and then died completely. The chatter in the grand ballroom evaporated. 150 guests fell into a silence so profound, so absolute, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I saw a server freeze mid-stride, a tray of champagne flutes trembling in her hand. Time itself seemed to stop. All I could see was Chloe, standing there with her chest heaving, her hand still raised slightly, and my glasses lying broken on the floor beside the pristine, white wedding cake. But it wasn't the slap that truly hurt. It wasn't the burning on my cheek or the humiliation of being struck in front of a room full of people. No, the thing that broke my heart happened in that silence. I looked for my son. I looked for Liam. And I found him, standing not 5 feet away, next to his best man. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at a spot on the floor, his face pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even flinch. In that single, deafening moment of his inaction, the boy I had raised was gone. And the man who stood in his place was a stranger I didn't recognize at all. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the world was just the sound of my own breathing and the sight of my son's cowardice. Then, slowly, as if moving through water, I bent down. My knees creaked in protest, but I ignored them. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, I picked up the 2 pieces of my shattered glasses from the floor. I didn't look at Chloe. I didn't look at Liam. I looked straight ahead, at the grand double doors of the ballroom. That's when the whispers started. As I began to walk, the silence broke, replaced by a low, toxic murmur that spread through the room like a virus. It was the sound of 150 people suddenly having the story of a lifetime to tell. "Did you see that?" Utterly unhinged, a woman in pearls whispered to her husband. "Poor Chloe. On her wedding day," another clucked sympathetically. "Her mother-in-law must be losing her mind. Well, you know Eleanor since Richard died. She's become such a recluse. It's sad, really." Each word was a tiny, poisoned dart. No one saw a woman who had been publicly assaulted. They saw a problem, an inconvenience, an old woman making a scene and ruining a perfectly good party. In their world of manicured lawns and flawless facades, the truth is always less important than appearances. And I, with my broken glasses and my burning cheek, had just shattered the appearance of the perfect family. My walk felt like a mile. With every step, the hot, blinding pain in my chest began to cool and harden into something else. Something heavy and solid. It was resolve. I could almost hear my late husband Richard's voice in my ear, that calm, steady baritone he always used when he was about to give me the unvarnished truth. "Never let them mistake your kindness for weakness, Ellie. Never." For years, I had been kind. I had been accommodating. I had bitten my tongue and opened my checkbook, all in the name of a mother's love, all to keep the peace. I had protected my son from the consequences of his own poor choices, and in doing so, I had made him weak. I had made him vulnerable to a predator like Chloe. I had, in my own way, helped build the cage she now rattled. That's the moment it truly became clear. My grief for the son I had lost was being replaced by a cold, clear-eyed anger at the man he had become. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about a lifetime of love and sacrifice, being treated like a disposable asset. By the time I reached the polished brass handles of the ballroom doors, I wasn't a victim fleeing a scene. I was a general, making a strategic retreat. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the cool night air, the sounds of the party finally fading behind me. I didn't run. I walked calmly through the grand, empty lobby, past the bewildered-looking coat-check girl, and out into the sprawling parking lot. I got into my 10-year-old sedan, the very car Chloe had so often ridiculed, and it felt like the safest place on earth. The engine started with a familiar, comforting rumble. My hands were trembling now, the adrenaline finally hitting me. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My cheek was already red and starting to swell. But my eyes were different. The soft, accommodating warmth was gone. In its place was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a very long time. It was the woman Richard had married, the one who built a life with him from nothing, the one who wasn't afraid of a fight. I pulled out my phone from my worn black purse. I scrolled past Liam's name, past the names of friends and family who were still inside, celebrating my humiliation. I found the number I needed, the one I kept for emergencies, hoping I'd never have to use it again. The phone rang twice before a familiar, no-nonsense voice answered. "Arthur, Arthur," I said, and I was amazed at how steady my voice sounded, despite the tremor in my hands. "It's Eleanor Vance." There was a pause on the other end, and I knew he could hear the tension in my voice. "Ellie? What's wrong?" "It's happened," I said, my voice cracking just once on that single word. "The things we discussed. It's worse than we thought. I need you." "Where are you?" he asked. "All business now. I'm leaving the Glenwood Country Club. I'm on my way home." "Stay put. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he commanded. "No," I interrupted. "Meet me at my house. And Arthur, bring the Richard Vance portfolio. Bring all of it." The 15-minute drive home from the country club felt like a journey across a desert. The familiar, tree-lined streets of Glenwood were a blur of shadows and streetlights. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, I cut the engine and just sat there in the humming silence, the keys to the house on Sparrow Hill clutched in my fist. Her starter home, my sanctuary, my fortress. The home my husband Richard and I had built together, filled with 30 years of laughter, tears, and memories. Walking inside was like stepping into another world. The chaos and humiliation of the ballroom faded, replaced by the quiet, comforting scent of old books and lemon oil. I walked through the dark rooms, my hand trailing along the familiar shapes of the furniture. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked its steady, rhythmic beat, a heartbeat for a house that was suddenly holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I ended up in the study, Richard's favorite room. It's paneled in dark cherry wood, lined floor to ceiling with books on history, finance, and art. His leather armchair still sits by the window, a silent sentinel. And on the mantelpiece, there's a silver-framed photograph of him, taken on our last anniversary. He's smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, looking at me with that expression that always made me feel like I was the only person in the world. I sank into his chair, the worn leather sighing under my weight, and I stared at his picture. And that's when the dam of my resolve finally broke, not with a flood of tears, but with a quiet, agonizing torrent of self-doubt. "Oh, Richard," I whispered to the empty room, "you would never believe what our boy has become." But even as I said it, a more difficult, more painful question began to claw its way up my throat. Was it really him? Or was it me? Did I do this? Let me be honest with you, because I had to be honest with myself in that moment. Richard and I, we had to fight for everything we built. We started with nothing, but I never wanted that struggle for Liam. I wanted him to have a softer life. When he got his first credit card in college and maxed it out, I paid it off, telling myself it was a one-time mistake. When he couldn't make the down payment on his first car, I co-signed the loan, believing it would help him build his credit. For the last 3 years, as I watched his finances spiral while his lifestyle inflated, I kept writing checks. I told myself I was helping, supporting, being a good mother. It's a bitter pill to swallow when you realize you've spent years mistaking enabling for love. I had padded every sharp corner of his life, cushioned every fall, and in doing so, I had deprived him of his own backbone. I had raised a son who never learned the simple, brutal equation of action and consequence. I had raised a man so accustomed to being rescued that he saw his own mother not as a person, but as a safety net to be cut down and sold for parts. Did I raise a son so weak he could be so easily led by a woman like Chloe? The thought was a physical pain, sharper than the slap. The boy I protected is gone. But the man who stood by and watched his mother be publicly assaulted, he has to face the consequences. My love for my son couldn't be a suicide pact for my own dignity. My grief and my guilt swirled together and then settled, hardening back into that cold, clear resolve I'd felt in the car. The time for protecting Liam was over. It was time to protect Richard's legacy. And it was time to protect myself. With a new sense of purpose, I stood up and walked to the built-in safe hidden behind a false panel of books. I spun the combination, a sequence of numbers only Richard, Arthur, and I knew. The heavy door swung open, and I pulled out a heavy, leather-bound portfolio. On the cover, embossed in faded gold, were Richard's initials, R.E.V. This was it. The Richard Vance portfolio. I carried it to the heavy mahogany desk and placed it down. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the quiet room. Inside was everything. Bank ledgers from Swiss accounts, property deeds for commercial buildings I owned downtown, complex trust documents, and on the very top, a single, sealed manila envelope with my name written in Richard's familiar, elegant script. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, drawing strength from it. The doorbell rang, its clear chime cutting through the silence. Arthur was here. The war was about to begin. I opened the heavy oak door to find Arthur Grossman standing on my porch. At 70, Arthur still had the sharp, impatient energy of the top corporate litigator he'd been for 40 years. He was Richard's oldest friend, a man who didn't waste words and whose mind was still a steel trap. He took one look at my face, his gaze immediately locking onto the angry red mark on my cheek, and the polite concern in his gray eyes hardened into something sharp and dangerous. "Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble, "get me a scotch, and then you're going to tell me exactly what happened." He didn't wait for an invitation, just walked past me into the study as he had 1,000 times before. While I poured him a drink and one for myself, he stood in front of Richard's portrait, his hands clasped behind his back. I recounted the whole sordid story, from the rehearsal dinner demand to the slap by the wedding cake, to my son's gutless silence. I didn't cry. My voice was flat, detached, like a witness giving a police statement. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. He took the glass from my hand, his expression grim. "I knew it," he finally said, more to himself than to me. "I knew there was something wrong with that girl from the start." "You did. Richard's memorial service," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "After you'd gone to speak with the caterers, Chloe came up to me. She was talking about how beautiful the house was, what a wonderful legacy Richard had left. And then she had the audacity to ask me about the property taxes on Sparrow Hill. At his wake, Ellie. I told Richard's grieving best friend that I was sorry for his loss, and she saw an opportunity to appraise the real estate. Hearing that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This wasn't a recent plot. It had been her endgame from the very beginning. I gestured to the mahogany desk, where the portfolio sat like an unexploded bomb. "He knew," I said. "Richard always knew people. He saw the world in black and white, assets and liabilities. He set this all up as a contingency." Arthur sat down in the chair opposite the desk. "All business now." "Okay, Ellie. Forget the emotional part for a minute. Let's talk strategy. What is your objective here?" It was a good question, and one I had asked myself on the drive home. "I don't want to destroy him, Arthur," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. "He is still my son, but I want him to understand. I want them both to understand that actions have consequences. I want to remove my safety net, the one he doesn't even know exists, and let them face the world they've built for themselves. I want to protect what Richard and I built, from our own son." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the portfolio. "Then it's an unwinding," he said, "a systematic severance. To do it right, we need to know everything, their exact financial state, their debts, their assets, if any. We need to see just how deep this rot goes." He reached for the portfolio and opened it. He spent the next hour silently reading, his sharp eyes scanning documents that detailed a life of quiet, hidden wealth that I had so carefully maintained. He saw the deeds, the offshore accounts, the monthly transfers I'd been making to a shell account that then paid Liam's rent and car insurance under the guise of landlord discounts and corporate bonuses. He paused when he got to the sealed envelope on top. "Is this?" "Yes," I said, "his last letter to me. Instructions, in case something like this ever happened." I hadn't opened it. I wasn't ready. Just knowing it was there was enough. He gave a respectful nod and set it aside. "All right," he said, closing the portfolio. "Here's what we do. I have a man, a private investigator, the best there is, discreet, thorough. He'll get me a full workup on Liam and Chloe by tomorrow. In the meantime, I will start drafting the legal notices. A revocation of the lease guarantee. A cease and desist on all financial transfers. We'll prepare everything." He stood up, tucking the heavy portfolio under his arm. "You did the right thing calling me, Ellie. This isn't just a family squabble. This is a calculated attack. And you don't fight an attack like this with tears. You fight it with lawyers. You fight fire with fire, Ellie. But our fire," he said, a grim smile touching his lips, "will be built with facts, figures, and the full, unvarnished truth." He walked to the door and paused, turning back to look at me. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we go on the offensive." As I closed the door behind him, I walked back to the study window and watched his car disappear down the long driveway. It was the first time since that slap that I felt I wasn't completely alone in this. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to play the game. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I existed in a state of suspended animation, wandering through my silent house, waiting. I didn't answer the phone, which rang incessantly with calls I knew were from Liam, Chloe, or her parents, all ready with their own twisted version of events. I just waited. Arthur had promised a full report by the next afternoon, and I knew that whatever he brought me would be the final piece of the puzzle, the map that would guide my next move. He arrived at 4 o'clock sharp. I knew from the moment I saw his face that the news was worse than I had imagined. The professional mask of the lawyer was gone, replaced by the grim, angry expression of a friend who had just waded through filth on my behalf. He carried a thin file folder, which he placed on the dining room table with a quiet finality. "I thought I had prepared myself for the worst, Ellie," he said, pulling out a chair. "I was wrong." He opened the folder, and for the next hour, he laid out the truth of my son's life in stark, brutal detail. It was a masterpiece of deceit, a life built on a foundation of sand and financed by my love. The finances came first. Liam and Chloe were not just in debt, they were drowning in it. Arthur's investigator had found over $175,000 of it, high-interest credit cards, personal loans, 2 car payments on vehicles they couldn't afford, and a lease on a luxury apartment they were 3 months behind on. An eviction notice had already been filed. "And here's where the money went," Arthur said, sliding a spreadsheet across the table. It was a ledger of Chloe's spending. Thousands on designer clothes she wore once for an Instagram post, and then returned. Weekly spa treatments. Dinners at restaurants I hadn't been to in years. It was the meticulously documented cost of creating a fantasy. "She's not just financially irresponsible, Ellie," Arthur said, his voice laced with contempt. "She's a professional." My investigator dug into her past. This isn't her first rodeo. Before she met Liam, she had a habit of dating much older, wealthier men. One of them paid off a $30,000 credit card default for her just 6 months before she and Liam got engaged. "She's a parasite, and she has a system." I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. This was information, not emotion. This was evidence, but the worst was yet to come. Arthur paused, his expression softening with something like pity. "Ellie, what I'm about to show you is going to be the hardest to hear." He pulled out the final 2 pages from the folder. They were printouts of emails. My son's emails, sent from his work address. The investigator had his ways. For the past 6 months, Liam had been in communication with a law firm, a firm that specialized in elder law and estate litigation. He had been making inquiries. He had been asking very specific questions about the legal requirements for establishing a financial conservatorship over an aging parent. He had asked what evidence was needed to prove diminished mental capacity and how one could gain power of attorney if the parent was uncooperative. There it was, in black and white. This wasn't just my son being weak and manipulated by an ambitious woman. This was a premeditated plot. He had been actively researching legal pathways to strip me of my rights, my autonomy, and my assets. The family meeting, the comments about my age, the suggestions that I was lonely and couldn't care for myself. It wasn't just pressure. It was him building a case against me. The slap, I realized with a sickening lurch, would have been Exhibit A in their file. Mother's unstable, violent outburst. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. A strange, glacial calm settled over me. The pain and the grief I'd felt for the son I'd lost were burned away, replaced by a cold, surgical anger. The man who wrote those emails was not my son. He was an enemy who happened to share my DNA. I looked up from the damning pages and met Arthur's gaze. My decision was made. All the doubt, all the maternal hesitation, was gone. "So, that's the man he is," I said, and my voice was a stranger's, devoid of any warmth. "Not a son, but a predator in waiting." I pushed the folder back toward Arthur. "There's nothing left to discuss." "What do you want to do, Ellie?" he asked gently. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens Richard and I had planted. My gardens, my home. "You asked me last night what my objective was, Arthur," I said, turning back to him. "It's changed. It's not about teaching them a lesson anymore. It's about survival." My voice dropped, becoming as hard and clear as glass. "Prepare everything. It's time to pull the plug." Arthur looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not a flicker of surprise. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. The time for sorrow and shock was over. We were now in the clear, cold territory of action. "All right, Ellie," he said, his voice dropping into the calm, measured tone of a courtroom strategist. "Let's get to work." He didn't need to go back to his office. He reached down beside his chair and lifted his own worn leather briefcase onto the table. It clicked open with a satisfying snap. He was a man who came prepared. "When you called last night and mentioned the portfolio," he explained, "I anticipated this might be the destination. I drafted these this morning. They are, as of now, blank templates. But they are ready." He laid them out on the dining room table, a series of crisp, official-looking documents that felt like weapons. Let me tell you, there is a strange, chilling clarity that comes when you see your family's life reduced to a stack of legal papers. There were 4 documents in total. First was the lease guarantee revocation, a formal notice to the landlord of the downtown apartment where Liam and Chloe lived their influencer fantasy. Your signature here, Arthur pointed, will notify him that your personal financial guarantee for their lease is hereby null and void. They'll have 30 days to secure a new guarantor or face eviction. Second was the financial severance mandate. This was a direct order to my bank to cease all payments from the shell corporation I'd set up into Liam's accounts. This one cuts the power, Arthur said grimly. No more secret rent subsidies, no more bonuses to cover his car payments. The well runs dry, effective immediately. Third was a letter addressed to the manager of the Glenwood Country Club, the event payment guarantee annulment. This, Arthur said, tapping the paper, is the bombshell. It informs the venue that the Vance Family Trust will no longer be guaranteeing the payment for today's festivities. The bill will revert to the signatories on the contract, Liam and Chloe. And last, he pushed a single sheet of paper toward me, a codicil to the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance. It was simple, elegant, and brutal. It stated that the entirety of the inheritance previously designated for my son, Liam Richard Vance, would be redirected. "Where do you want it to go, Ellie?" Arthur asked gently. I didn't hesitate. "I want to start a foundation, in Richard's name, a fund to provide legal aid to elderly people who are being financially exploited by their own families." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "Poetic," he murmured, making a note at the bottom. He handed me a pen. It was a heavy, black fountain pen with a gold nib, Richard's old Mont Blanc, which I kept on the desk. It felt solid and right in my hand. I looked at the first document. There was no hesitation, no tremor. My signature, Eleanor Vance, flowed across the bottom of the page in clear, steady ink. I signed the next one, and the next. With each stroke of the pen, I wasn't destroying a family. I was cauterizing a wound. I was choosing my own survival over my son's comfort. I was honoring the man who had helped me build everything by refusing to let his legacy be squandered by a weak-willed boy and a greedy grifter. When I was done, my gaze fell on the sealed envelope from Richard that still lay on the edge of the desk. My first instinct was to open it, to see what final piece of advice he had left for me. But then I pushed it gently to the side. Not yet. This part, this fight, I had to do on my own. I had to know that the strength was mine, not just a final instruction from him. Arthur carefully gathered the signed and witnessed documents, placing them into a new folder. He closed his briefcase and stood up. The plan was armed. The contingency was now a reality. "So," he said, his voice quiet, "when do we deploy?" I stood up and walked to the hall closet, retrieving the simple, elegant black dress I had worn to the rehearsal dinner. I had no intention of staying a victim cowering in my home. The humiliation had been public. The response would be public as well. I looked at Arthur, my ally, my friend, the last link to the man I had loved. "Now, Arthur," I said, my voice ringing with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. "We're going back." The 10-minute drive back to the Glenwood Country Club was the quietest I had ever spent with Arthur. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the charged, focused quiet of 2 soldiers before a battle. I stared out the window at the passing landscape of perfect houses and manicured lawns, a world I had once felt a part of, but now saw as a foreign country. I was no longer one of them. I was an insurgent. There would be no coming back from this. The bridges I was about to burn would light my way forward, and there would be nothing left but ashes behind me. I felt a strange sense of peace in that finality. The anxiety was gone. The grief was gone. All that remained was a cold, clear purpose. As we pulled up to the grand, columned entrance of the club, Arthur put the car in park and turned to me, his hand on the door handle. "Last chance, Ellie," he said, his voice soft. "Are you absolutely sure about this? Once this door opens, it can't be closed again." I met his gaze in the dim light of the dashboard. "The door was already closed, Arthur," I replied. My son closed it when he stood by and did nothing. I'm just here to lock it. He nodded, a flicker of pride in his old eyes. All right then, let's go. The valet, a young man who had looked at me with such pity just an hour earlier, stared with wide-eyed shock as I stepped out of Arthur's car and handed him the keys. He saw the set of my jaw, the man in the expensive suit beside me, and the folder tucked under his arm, and he wisely said nothing. We didn't have to announce our arrival. Our presence was a shout in a quiet room. We walked through the main lobby, our footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As we reached the entrance to the grand ballroom, the muffled thump of the bass from the band grew louder, the sound of a party desperately trying to get back on track. We pushed the heavy doors open. If our entrance was a shout, the room's reaction was a gasp. The band was in the middle of a painfully upbeat rendition of some pop song, but the lead singer's voice faltered as he saw us. The drummer missed a beat. One by one, the instruments trailed off into a discordant, confused silence. The low hum of conversation died away as a ripple of awareness spread from the doorway through the crowd. Every single head in that room turned to face us. They saw me, Eleanor Vance, the humiliated mother-in-law, no longer looking broken, but dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, my expression unreadable. And beside me, they saw Arthur Grossman, one of the most feared litigators in the state, holding a legal folder like a weapon. For a moment, everyone was frozen. It was a tableau of shock, a sea of stunned faces, champagne glasses paused halfway to mouths, forks hovering over plates of half-eaten wedding cake. And then, of course, Chloe reacted. She had been holding court by the head table, no doubt spinning a tale of my tragic mental decline. When she saw us, her face, which had been arranged in an expression of pained sympathy, contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted fury. She slammed her champagne flute down on the table. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the dead silence. She began storming towards us, her white dress billowing around her, a bride marching into battle. "How dare you show your face here again? You come back to ruin the rest of my wedding." Liam, my son, scrambled to follow her, his face a mess of panic and confusion. "Mom, what is this? What are you doing?" he pleaded, his voice weak. Chloe reached us, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with narcissistic rage. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at my face. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get out of my wedding right now. You are not welcome here." I didn't flinch. I just stood there, waiting. This was her stage, her final performance. She opened her mouth to scream again, but before she could, Arthur took one calm, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone cut through her hysteria like a surgeon's scalpel. "Mrs. Vance is not here to argue," he said, his voice resonating with quiet, absolute authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. "We are here to deliver a series of legal notices that have immediate and binding effect." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, his gaze sweeping from Chloe's stunned face to Liam's terrified one. "I suggest," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than her scream, "that you listen very, very carefully." Chloe's furious command hung in the electric silence of the room. She was used to people obeying her, especially my son, but her words had no power here. Arthur simply looked at her, his expression as impassive as a granite cliff, and then he opened the folder. The soft rustle of the paper was the loudest sound I had ever heard. He took out the first document, holding it with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. He addressed my son, his voice calm and professional, the voice he'd used to dismantle corporate giants in court for 40 years. "Mr. Vance," he began, "let's start with your current residence, 14B, at the residences at Glenwood Park." Liam looked utterly bewildered. "What? What does my apartment have to do with anything?" "Everything," Arthur replied smoothly. He held up the paper. "This is a copy of your lease agreement, and attached to it is a personal financial guarantee. The guarantor, who made it possible for you to be approved for a lease so far outside your income bracket, was your mother, Eleanor Vance." As of my signature, notarized 1 hour ago, that guarantee has been legally and irrevocably revoked." He slid the paper onto a nearby table. "In short," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "your landlord will be notified in the morning. You and your wife will have 30 days to secure a new guarantor or vacate the property." "Guarantee," Liam stammered, looking at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Chloe, however, was silent. The first crack had appeared in her perfect porcelain facade, a flicker of genuine fear. Arthur didn't wait for my answer. He took out the second document. "Next," he said, his voice relentlessly even, "let's discuss your income." He laid out the details of the shell corporation Richard had set up years ago, a discretionary fund managed by me. He detailed the landlord credits that mysteriously lowered their rent each month, the work bonuses from a company that didn't exist that covered their car payments. He explained the systematic, secret transfers of funds that had kept their fantasy life afloat. "For the past 36 months, Arthur stated, his voice ringing through the silent ballroom, "your mother has been subsidizing your lifestyle to the tune of approximately $4,500 a month. That is a total of $162,000. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. $162,000. The number just hung there in the air, obscene and unbelievable. I saw the mayor's wife's eyes widen. I saw Chloe's parents, who had been looking so proud, shrink in their chairs. Liam looked as if he had been physically struck, all the color draining from his face as the reality of his entire adult life being a subsidized lie crashed down on him. This was the moment the narrative shattered. I was not the poor, dependent mother. I was the bank. I was the source. And they had just tried to foreclose on their own lifeline. Chloe finally found her voice, but it was a strangled, hysterical shriek. "Lies! You're lying! She doesn't have that kind of money! Look at her! Her car is ancient. Her clothes are from a department store. She's a retired professor living on a pension." Arthur just looked at her with something bordering on pity. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said coolly, before producing the final, brutal document. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping slightly, regarding this celebration. He held up the letter addressed to the country club. "This notice confirms the immediate cancellation of the $75,000 event payment guarantee provided by the Vance Family Trust. The full, outstanding balance for this venue, the catering, the flowers, and the band," he said, turning his gaze to meet the panicked eyes of the venue manager, who was already striding towards them, "is now the sole legal responsibility of the signatories of the event contract. Mr. and Mrs. Liam Vance." It was a kill shot. The party was over. The beautiful, expensive illusion they had built was now just a mountain of debt with their names on it. Liam finally stumbled forward, his hands outstretched as if to physically stop the words. "Mom, you've been paying for everything? All this time?" His voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, I saw the little boy he used to be, lost and terrified. "Yes, Liam," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent room. "All this time. For 3 years I thought I was helping you build a life. I thought I was giving you the support you needed to become the man your father would have been proud of." I took a step forward, looking past him to meet Chloe's horrified gaze. "My husband and I learned a long time ago that visible wealth attracts problems. We chose to live a quiet life. Invisible wealth, Richard used to say, gives you power, the power to protect your family." My eyes went back to my son, and the full weight of my sorrow and his betrayal was in my voice. "I never imagined," I finished, "that the one person I would need to protect it from would be you." My words fell into the silent room, and I saw the final flicker of hope die in my son's eyes. The truth, in all its devastating clarity, had finally landed. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from water. The carefully constructed world he had inhabited for the last 3 years had just been demolished, and he was standing alone in the rubble. "Mom, no, please," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't like that. We can fix this. It was a misunderstanding. Chloe was just stressed about the wedding, she didn't mean it. His excuses were pathetic, the desperate babbling of a man trying to reverse a tidal wave. Before I could respond, a new player entered the scene. The venue manager, a stern-looking man named Mr. Harris, had reached them. He stepped in front of Liam and Chloe, his face a mask of professional displeasure. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "We have a significant outstanding balance that requires immediate settlement. Do you have a credit card you'd like to place on file?" The practical, real-world consequence, delivered so calmly, seemed to snap Chloe out of her shock. But what came next wasn't remorse or sadness. It was pure, unfiltered narcissistic rage. Her carefully curated mask of the perfect sweet bride didn't just crack, it exploded. Her head whipped around, and she fixed her venomous gaze on me. "You!" she screamed, and the sound was raw and ugly. "You did this. You planned this from the beginning. You couldn't stand to see your son happy with someone else. You were always jealous of me, of our life. You're a sick, twisted monster." It was a truly ugly thing to witness. The guests, who had been frozen in shocked silence, began to back away, as if her fury was a physical force. Arthur put a steadying hand on my arm, but I didn't need it. I just watched her. When her rage at me was spent, she whirled on her new husband, the man she had sworn to love and honor just hours before. "And you," she spat at Liam, her voice dripping with contempt. "You told me she was a weak, confused old woman. You told me this would be easy. You promised me a life, a future. You are useless, a pathetic, useless coward. You've ruined everything. You've ruined my life." She was shrieking now, her face blotchy and red, her immaculate wedding dress looking like a costume on a madwoman. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger or even vindication. I just felt a profound, empty sadness. Sadness for the son I had lost, and a strange, clinical pity for this broken, hateful young woman whose entire world was a fantasy she could no longer afford. I let her tirade burn itself out. When she finally fell silent, panting and sobbing, I took one last look at my son. He was just standing there, flinching under his new wife's verbal assault, a completely broken man. I spoke, and my voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "The life you wanted was a fantasy, Liam," I said softly, "and you were willing to sacrifice your own mother to pay for it. The price is now due." I looked from his shattered face to Chloe's tear-streaked, hate-filled one. "This was never about the house. It was never about the money," I told them, my voice filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "It was about a line of basic human decency and respect. You didn't just cross it, you set it on fire." With that, I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the wreckage of their wedding, on the whispers of the guests, on the last, desperate cry of, "Mom, wait," that followed me across the room. Arthur and I walked toward the grand ballroom doors, not with the haste of a retreat, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a task completed. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image was already burned into my memory, my son and his bride, standing alone in the center of their ruined party, surrounded by the debris of their own greed, as the man with the bill closed in. The 3 days that followed the wedding were the quietest I have ever known. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and unnerving calm. My house, the fortress on Sparrow Hill, was no longer a target. It was a sanctuary once more. I unplugged the landline. I turned my cell phone to silent. I spent hours in my garden, pulling weeds with a methodical focus, feeling the sun on my back, and trying not to think. But of course, I thought of nothing else. There is a strange emptiness that follows a righteous war. You win, you achieve your objective, but the battlefield is still littered with casualties. And in this case, the main casualty was the memory of the boy I had raised. It was a victory that felt like a funeral. I had saved myself, but I had lost my son, and I was beginning to understand that perhaps I had lost him long before that night. The echoes from the outside world reached me, as I knew they would, through Arthur. He called me on the 3rd day, his voice carefully neutral, giving me what he called a situation report. The Glenwood wedding slap, as it was apparently now being called, was the scandal of the season. At first, The story had been the one Chloe had tried to write. The senile, cruel mother ruining her son's perfect day. But the truth, Arthur told me, had a way of seeping out. Details of the canceled payments, of the secret financial support, had somehow leaked. Now, the narrative had flipped. The whispers in the grocery store aisles and at the club's tennis courts were of the manipulative bride, the weak-willed son, and the quiet, dignified mother who had finally had enough. Public opinion, for what it was worth, had become my unlikely ally. The practical consequences had been swift and brutal. The country club was, as expected, suing them for the full cost of the event. Their landlord, no longer backed by my guarantee, had served them an official eviction notice. They were, in the span of a single evening, socially and financially radioactive. And then there were the voicemails. Late one night, I poured myself a small glass of sherry, sat in Richard's study, and finally listened to the messages my son had left. There were 7 of them. I listened to them all, one after the other, like a judge reviewing evidence. The first was pure, sputtering rage. "How could you, Mom? How could you humiliate us like that? In front of everyone. You've ruined our lives." It was a child's tantrum, filled with accusation and devoid of any self-awareness. The next few devolved into a pathetic, whining self-pity. "We're being evicted. Chloe won't stop crying. Everyone is talking about us. It's all your fault. Our wedding gifts won't even cover the deposit for a new apartment." The final message was the one that truly sealed it. His voice was different. It was the wheedling, pleading tone he'd used as a teenager when he wanted to borrow the car after he'd already been grounded. "Mom, look, I know we were all upset," he began, the royal "we" a cowardly shield. "But we're family. You can't just let this happen. We just need a little help to get out of this mess. Just a loan. I promise, we'll pay you back this time. Please, Mom, just call me back." I listened to all 7 messages, waiting for 2 words. Just 2. "I'm sorry." But they never came. Not once. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the slap, the conspiracy, the years of deceit, the public humiliation. There was only the empty cry of a spoiled child whose favorite toy had been taken away. He still didn't understand. He still thought the problem was the money. With a profound and final sadness, I held my finger down on the screen of my phone. "Delete all voicemails," the prompt asked. I pressed yes. The echoes were gone, and all that was left was the silence. A week passed. The silence in my house on Sparrow Hill began to feel less like an absence and more like a presence. It was the sound of peace, a quiet I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years. The war was over, but there were still logistical loose ends to tie up, the most important of which was settling my account with Arthur. He came over on a Thursday afternoon. The oppressive tension of our last few meetings was gone, replaced by the easy comfort of old friendship. We sat in the sunroom overlooking the gardens, a pot of tea between us. After we had chatted for a bit about the weather and his grandchildren, I decided it was time. I opened my checkbook, which I had placed on the table, and wrote out a check for his final invoice. The amount was substantial, as it should have been. He had been my general, my strategist, and my rock. I pushed the check across the polished surface of the table. "Arthur," I said, my voice thick with a gratitude I could barely put into words. "I don't know how I can ever thank you. You saved more than just my home. You saved my sanity." He looked at the check, then at me. He didn't reach for it. Instead, with a gentle finger, he pushed it slowly back across the table toward me. "I can't accept this, Ellie," he said quietly. I was stunned. "What? Arthur, don't be ridiculous. Your work was invaluable. You've earned every penny and more." He shook his head, a sad, distant look in his eyes. This was never about the money. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Did Richard ever tell you about my sister, Catherine?" I searched my memory. "I remember you had a sister who moved to Arizona, but that's about all." "That's because I don't like to talk about her," he said, his voice tight. He took a slow sip of his tea. "When my father died, he left my mother in a similar position to you. A widow, financially comfortable, but lonely. My sister, she was my family's version of Chloe. Ambitious, charming, and rotten to the core. She chipped away at my mother's confidence for years, convincing her she was incapable, that her memory was failing, that she couldn't handle her own affairs. Of all the shocks I had experienced in the past few weeks, this was the one that truly took my breath away. The parallels were chilling. I was a young lawyer then, he continued, staring out at the garden, working 80 hours a week, trying to make partner. I saw the signs, but I didn't understand what they meant. I thought my mother was just being generous. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. My sister had convinced my mother to sign over the deed to her house and had drained most of her savings for a series of business ventures that never materialized. She left our mother with almost nothing. He fell silent, and I could feel the old, helpless anger radiating off him. I couldn't stop her, he finally said. I didn't have the power, the resources, or the wisdom back then, and I have lived with that failure for 40 years. He looked back at me, his eyes shining with an emotion I couldn't quite place. And then Richard found out. You're Richard. He didn't make a big show of it. He just quietly stepped in. He hired a financial planner for my mother, set up a new trust that my sister couldn't touch, and personally reviewed her case to stop the bleeding. He saved what was left of my mother's dignity, Ellie. He never asked for a dime. He just did it, because that's the man he was. He looked down at the check on the table, then back at me, and his voice was thick with emotion. This, he said, tapping the check with his finger, was never a job for me. This was a debt. Helping you, Ellie. Giving you the help and protection I couldn't give my own mother. This was for her. He pushed the check the rest of the way back to me. Consider Richard's long-paid debt to my family and my debt to him, finally settled in full. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, tears blurring my vision, as the full weight of his words washed over me. This fight hadn't just been my own. It had been the culmination of old loyalties, of quiet debts, and of a promise made between friends long ago. My husband was still protecting me, even from beyond the grave. The months that followed were quiet. The autumn leaves turned and fell, and a peaceful blanket of snow settled over Glenwood. The scandal, like all scandals in a town like this, faded into the background, replaced by newer, more interesting gossip. I found a new rhythm for my life, one that wasn't dictated by my son's latest crisis. I volunteered at the local museum, had weekly dinners with Arthur, and took a trip to Italy to see the art I had only ever taught from books. I was healing. Then, 6 months after the wedding, I ran into an old acquaintance in the produce aisle of the grocery store. She was the wife of one of Richard's former business partners. We exchanged pleasantries, and then she got that hesitant, pitying look in her eye that I had come to despise. "Eleanor, dear," she began, lowering her voice. "I don't know if you've heard about Liam and Chloe." I braced myself. "I haven't," I said simply. "Well," she said, leaning closer, "they're expecting a baby, due in the spring." I must have gone pale because she quickly patted my arm. "I'm so sorry. I probably shouldn't have said anything, but I thought you should know." I murmured something polite and quickly paid for my groceries, my heart hammering against my ribs. A grandchild. The two words I had longed to hear for years now felt like a lead weight in my stomach. An innocent child, about to be born into that chaos, to be raised by a weak-willed man and a narcissistic woman. A child who would be taught to resent me, to see me as the monster who had ruined their parents' lives. My grandchild, and I would never know them. That night, for the first time in months, the old patterns came rushing back. The maternal instinct, that fierce, primal urge to protect and to fix, overwhelmed my hard-won peace. I sat down at the desk in Richard's study, the glow of the computer screen illuminating the dark room, and I started to type an email to Liam. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pouring out all the complicated emotions I had kept locked away. "Liam," I wrote, "I heard your news. For the sake of this child, your child, we have to find a way forward. A baby deserves a family. A baby deserves grandparents. I am willing to open a dialogue, to help you get back on your feet, if you are truly willing to take responsibility for your actions." I went on for paragraphs, offering olive branches, suggesting therapy, even hinting at financial assistance to provide a stable home for the baby. My heart ached as I wrote it. I was offering him a road back, a way to mend the bridge he had so spectacularly burned. My finger hovered over the send button, and then I stopped. I took a deep breath and forced myself to reread the message from the beginning. I saw it then, with a painful, devastating clarity. It was the letter of an enabler. I was doing it again. I was making his child's well-being my responsibility to fix. I was offering him a key to a door he hadn't even bothered to knock on. He hadn't called to apologize. He hadn't written a letter. He had made no effort. His child was about to be born, and he was still waiting for me to make the first move, to offer the solution. I would be teaching my grandchild, before they were even born, that our family's love was conditional, that it could be bought back with bad behavior as long as a baby was used as a bargaining chip. With a resolve that came from the deepest, most wounded part of my soul, I dragged the email to the trash icon on my screen. The little swoosh sound as it vanished felt like the most definitive sound in the world. The next morning, I called Arthur. My voice was calm and clear. "Arthur," I said, "I have a new project for you. I need your help setting up a trust." "Oh," he said, a note of caution in his voice. "For whom?" "For my grandchild," I said. "An irrevocable educational trust, for their college, their future. I want it to be managed by you, and I want it to be airtight. Liam and Chloe are not to be beneficiaries. They cannot touch a single penny. This is for the child, and the child alone." It was an act of love, I realized. A pure, protective love for a person I might never meet, completely separate from the toxic, broken relationship I had with his parents. I could love my grandchild without sacrificing myself for my son. It was the hardest and most important lesson I had ever learned. Another year passes. The wheel of seasons turns once more, bringing with it a sense of distance from the firestorm of the wedding. It's funny how time works. The events that once felt like the defining, catastrophic center of your universe eventually settle into a part of your history, a scar that reminds you of a battle you survived. I found myself standing at a podium, a place I hadn't been in years. I was back at my old university, in a lecture hall filled with the bright, eager faces of students. They had invited me to give a guest lecture on Renaissance art, but I had asked to speak on a different topic. In the projector's light, a slide glowed on the screen behind me. It was a picture of a beautiful, handcrafted ceramic bowl, its surface crisscrossed with delicate veins of gold. "This," I began, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone, "is an example of kintsugi. It's the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by mending the areas of breakage with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold. As a philosophy, it treats breakage and repair as part of the history of an object, rather than something to one conceal." I paused, looking out at the young faces. The kintsugi masters believe that when something has suffered damage and has a history, it becomes more beautiful. The breaks are not weaknesses, they are proof of resilience, proof of a history that has been survived. I took a breath. This was the real reason I was here. "A year ago," I continued, "my own life was shattered into 1,000 pieces. I was faced with a choice, to sweep up the shards and try to forget they ever existed, or to try and put them back together into something new, something stronger. That is why I am here today to announce the formation of the Vance Grant for Elder Justice." A quiet murmur went through the lecture hall. I explained the grant's purpose: a fund, endowed in my late husband's name, dedicated to providing pro bono legal services to seniors in our community who are facing financial exploitation and abuse, particularly from within their own families. The inheritance that might have once fueled a life of entitled fantasy would now fuel a fight for dignity for countless others. My grandson Oliver was born that spring. I saw a picture of him once, on the social media page of one of Chloe's distant relatives. He is beautiful. I have not met him. Liam and Chloe moved out of state, to a place where no one knew their story. The educational trust for Oliver is in place, quietly growing, a silent promise of a future he will one day be able to claim for himself. I may never get to teach my grandson about art, but I can help build a world that is a little kinder to grandparents. This grant has become the gold in my own kintsugi bowl. Working with Arthur, who chairs the selection committee, I now have a purpose that rises from the ashes of my personal pain. I read the stories of other parents, other grandparents, and I helped give them the one thing I was so fortunate to have: a fighting chance. It has renewed me. It has given my life a second act I never expected. My story is no longer just a private tragedy. It has become a public testimony. I am writing this last part from my sunroom, looking out at my garden. It's late spring, and the gardenias Richard planted for our 25th anniversary are in full, fragrant bloom. The air is sweet with their scent. For so long, this house, this garden, felt like a battleground, a territory to be defended. Now, it just feels like home again. People who have heard my story sometimes ask me if I feel like I won. It's a strange question. If this was a war, I suppose I did. I protected my assets. I defended my dignity. I stood my ground and refused to be broken. But it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a quiet, somber peace. The kind of peace that settles over a landscape after a great storm has passed, leaving the air clean and the world irrevocably changed. The real lesson, the one that took me a lifetime to learn, is that true strength isn't about winning fights. It's about having the wisdom to know which fights are worth having, and the courage to walk away from the ones that will only destroy you. For years, I fought a silent, losing battle to win my son's love and respect, believing that my sacrifice was the price of admission. The greatest act of love I ever showed him, and myself, was finally letting go. I no longer wait for a phone call that will never come. I no longer ache for a relationship that was built on a false foundation. I have accepted the truth. You cannot force someone to be the person you wish they were. You can only decide how much of your own peace you are willing to sacrifice for their illusion. My price, I decided, was no longer for sale. I spend my days now working with the grant, tending my garden, and enjoying the company of true friends like Arthur. I am building a new legacy, one defined not by what I endured, but by what I chose to create from the wreckage. This morning, I was outside pruning the roses, my hands deep in the rich soil. The sun was warm on my back, and the only sound was the gentle buzz of bees and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The silence in the garden wasn't empty. It was full of peace, full of a life that was, finally and completely, my own. Thank you for staying with me through that entire story. It isn't easy to talk about, but I believe sharing our experiences is how we heal and help others feel less alone in their own struggles. If my story has one core message, it's this: you cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm. For years, I confused enabling with love, and in my effort to protect my son from the world, I forgot to protect myself from him. I learned that true love for my son had to include loving myself enough to finally say, no more. My financial independence, which I had always guarded quietly, became not a weapon, but a shield. It was the tool that allowed me to enforce the boundaries that were necessary for my own survival and dignity. It's a reminder that your security and your right to make your own choices are worth defending, no matter who is challenging them. To protect the privacy of everyone involved, I've changed some of the names and specific details in this story. But I want you to know that the feelings of betrayal, the difficult choices, and the lessons learned are entirely real. I've found so much strength in hearing from others, so I want to ask you a question that I struggled with for years. Where is the line between helping and enabling? Have you ever had to make an impossible choice to protect your own peace from a family member who refused to respect your boundaries? Your stories matter, and sharing them in the comments below creates a space where none of us have to feel alone in these struggles. Thank you so much for listening and for being a part of this community. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.